Bob Nudd began fishing at the age of 23. He began international match fishing in 1982. He has won gold medals in the World Championship team matches in 1985, 1988, 1991 and 1994. He has been individual world champion 3 times, in the years 1990, 1991 and 1994, and is the most successful international angler in history. Bob Nudd is a fisherman from whom we can all learn something. In springtime, Bob often spends some time in Ireland competing in international matches. Even during the free days between matches, Bob can be found at the waterside improving his fishing techniques. Because even a super champion is never perfect. At least, that's Bob's conviction. Today, Bob is visiting one of the many deep lakes in Northern Ireland. Anyone who wants to be successful at feeder fishing needs something more than just a feeder itself. Bob takes all his rods because you never know. Circumstances can dictate that a heavier or lighter rod may be needed. The swim looks promising. The water is choppy, but Bob likes that. Most modern feeder rods are provided with 3 different quiver tips according to the circumstances. Running water demands a heavier tip than still water, and Bob employs a heavy 3-ounce tip for strong flowing water, a 1-ounce tip for still water, and a 2-ounce tip which is an all-rounder. Despite the strong wind, Bob chooses the 1-ounce tip because the lighter, the better. The construction of the hook length begins with a double fold and twisting of the main line. By this method, a stiff section is created which acts as a kind of boom to prevent tangling. When this section is of the correct length, the twisted line is fixed in place with a simple knot. A knot is also tied on the end of the twisted section, so that a small loop is formed to which the trace can be attached. So that the feeder can be easily changed, a link swivel is the best choice. After finishing the twisted section, the remaining line must be of sufficient length, and here the link swivel is attached. Now with a length of approximately 30 centimeters and a double knot, the construction is completed. The plastic feeder holds the bait secure longer than a cage feeder and is therefore chosen for deep water. The feeder is attached via the link swivel, and a biting fish can now swim freely over a certain length with the hook bait. The choice of trace is of crucial importance. When the fish are feeding boldly, the trace must be kept a short distance. At these times, you can see the bite much earlier. Using a longer trace makes the fish less suspicious, but you can run the risk of not seeing the bite. A good average length to start with is about 1 meter. Bob Nudd believes in ready mixed groundbait, providing it's of good quality. With the arrival of perfect feeder mixes, the fisherman of today doesn't have to lie awake at nights worrying about complicated recipes, and as a result can concentrate on his fishing technique. The moistening of the mix must be done with precision. The water is added bit by bit until the desired result is achieved. But apart from the feed, Bob has another secret weapon. It is known that bream are very fond of worms. The worms are cut into bits and provide an excellent addition to the feeder mix. It is wise not to cut up all the worms at once, but bit by bit, so that they remain alive longer. First, a few chopped worms are placed on the mix, and on top of this, some casters are laid. This delicious snack is pushed into the feeder with the groundbait. Practiced feeder fishers call this a sandwich. A maggot is an excellent hook bait, but for larger bream, the worm is still favorite. Then a caster is hooked on, so that the worm can't wriggle off the hook. This combination is definitely irresistible for the ever-hungry bream. After casting, the line is checked so that the wind does not make a bow in the line before it sinks. Feeder fishing is designed primarily for bream and roach. This is especially true for bream because they are mainly bottom-feeding fish. The swim is good, and Bob's technique needs no further comment. So, it's time for action. In a plastic feeder, you can squeeze the mix fairly firmly together, and that's also necessary when you're fishing deep water. The mix must remain in the feeder until it reaches the bottom. However, if there is still some mix in the feeder whilst you are playing the fish, then you have made the mix too hard. Finding the happy medium is just a question of experience. When fishing deeper water, you should never use a cage feeder. The plastic feeder ensures the feed remains in place until it reaches the bottom. When you're using a cage feeder, the mix spreads out during sinking, and the feeder therefore is empty before reaching the bottom. That's why a plastic feeder is recommended for deep water. The fish are on the feed. You only begin to catch in quantity when there is sufficient feed in the swim. A carpet of feed must also be laid when fishing with the feeder, just as much as when fishing with a pole. When the bream find the baited area, it can be just like a production line. And after each fish, more new feed is introduced. In this way, you keep catching. Bob's razor-sharp reactions to a bite mostly ensure that the fish is hooked in the front of the mouth. It's extremely important that you always fish in the same spot. To achieve this goal, the feeder angler selects a reference point on the far bank of the water and always casts in this direction. Thanks to the choice of a light tip, the bites often pull the top right round, without undue resistance being felt. As long as circumstances allow, Bob happily fishes with as light a tip as possible. When filling the feeder, the mix should not be squeezed too tightly. Only once it has settled in the bottom should the feed come out. This is achieved by pulling the feeder gently with the rod. After the feeder hits the bottom, it's dragged back about a meter. In this way, the mix is pulled out of the feeder, and the long trace is pulled tight with the baited hook precisely over the baited area. Another one. Bob Nudd doesn't like long, pointless fights. As a contest angler, he knows only too well how valuable the available fishing time is. But also for the sake of the fish, it's far better that the fight be kept as short as possible. When the fish is still lively in the landing net, it's proof that the fight did not take too long. A bite can be indicated in several ways. When bream are the quarry, Bob likes to let the bite develop properly. In the case of roach, it is quite different. Then one strikes immediately. In this Irish lake, it's mainly bream. The bream here are very strong and put a good curve in the rod. Bob has changed over to maggots for bait instead of the worm. The fish are here and taking greedily. At this time, a bunch of maggots is also very effective. Pulling the feeder is essential when you're fishing in still or slow-moving water. You cast out, wait for the feeder to sink to the bottom, and then pull the feeder towards you with a rod, so that the feeder contents are released. The feeder must also be empty to ensure efficient striking. The day has not ended yet, but it has been enjoyment enough for Bob. A couple of hours fishing is mostly enough to get a good net full of bream. Bob has again learned something, and as always, the bream are returned to their freedom. Not all lakes are deep. Here we can expect an average depth of about 2 meters, and so we can fish perfectly well with a cage feeder. The fact that Bob still fishes here with the plastic feeder is due to another reason. At the beginning of the season, the baited area must be laid down, and so Bob prefers a feeder that can quickly put in a large amount of bait. When the fish have found the baited area, Bob changes to a smaller cage feeder. In shallow water, Bob always uses a line clip. After casting to the desired spot, the line is put into this clip. All following casts will therefore be of the same distance. Precision is of paramount importance for the feeder fisherman. On occasions, shallow water may also be fished with a plastic feeder, but generally for other reasons than here for baiting the area. When reeling in, a plastic feeder is more swiftly released from the bottom than a cage feeder. On an uneven bottom, this is an advantage, because with a cage feeder, you can get snagged up frequently. Only under these circumstances is it better to fish with a plastic feeder in shallow water. This is the kind of thing Bob is always considering whilst he is fishing. Every idea is put into practice, and with success. Thanks to the line clip, the casting distance is defined. But the direction is also important. By choosing a fixed point on the other bank, direction and distance are now controlled, and the hook bait will land precisely in the baited area. Time to change over to the cage feeder. Cage feeders come in narrow and wide mesh and are provided with an interchangeable lead. Here, Bob selects a fine meshed feeder with a weight of approximately 20 grams. Bob keeps some of the maggots in a separate container to which water is added. As a result of this, the maggots absorb air so that some of them float. By placing a small handful of these maggots in the water, Bob can easily select the floating ones and use them as hook bait. A perfect hook bait for soft bottoms. A small shot is attached to the trace a short distance from the hook. The result is an attractively suspended bait which is held in position above the bottom by the lead shot. An irresistible morsel for the already actively feeding bream. An important factor when feeder fishing is the length of the trace. If the fish are feeding well, the length of the trace may be shortened. The fish therefore only have to move a short distance with the bait before a bite is registered. You fish very sharply. If, however, the hook bait is being taken without a visible bite, it's a sign that the trace is too long. But if the fish stop biting at all, then the trace is definitely too short. The optimum length of the trace depends, therefore, above all, on the behavior of the fish. What is certain is that the angler must experiment until he has achieved the desired result. Using a cage feeder, the mix already comes free while sinking. These morsels are floating down more slowly and attracting the fish to the baited area. The mix inside the feeder is released when the feeder is pulled by the rod. Only then can you be sure that you're fishing with an empty feeder, and you will thus have more success at hooking a fish. In healthy waters, the bream can be a first-class sporting fish. The fish is strong and makes the rod bend well. A marvelous feeling. This is Bob's last bream for today. He has enjoyed it to the full. Not only the many fights of the fish, but also the natural surroundings. It's a lovely feeling at the end of a successful day to return the fish to the water. As a match fisherman, Bob has long been accustomed to keeping his fish in a large, fine mesh net, within which the fish can't suffer any damage. As a result, these bream are being returned to their freedom in tip-top condition. Waters containing no bream are rare, but they do still exist. This closed lake is gin clear and contains only roach and, of course, predators. Preference is given to a small cage with a weight of 20 grams. The Paternoster is chosen here because then the hookbait tends to stay higher in the water before it falls, so you would better feel the bites on the drop. Firstly, a piece of line is knotted onto the main line, and at the end of this, a small loop is formed. Also on the end of the main line, a similar small loop is tied, to which the link swivel will later allow the changing of the feeder. The side line is about 50 centimeters long, and the hook length can be attached by the loop-to-loop method. Today, Bob picks a fine line to a size 18 hook. The total length of the side line, including the trace, is between 120 and 150 centimeters. For roach fishing, Bob is going to prepare a simple mix in which hemp is an essential ingredient. He uses here about 40% Van Den Eynde brown crumb, 20% ground hemp, an essential ingredient for roach, and 40% active feeder, the feeder mix that has been field tested by Bob himself. These ingredients are first mixed together, and then water is added bit by bit. The mix must not be too wet, because then it will stick in the feeder. The correct amount of moisture is a question of experience. The use of the sieve is necessary to achieve a regular consistency of the feed. The lumps are made smaller in this way, and occasional impurities remain behind. Here, nature is still undisturbed. The water quality is good, and there is a rich insect life. The birds prosper on the emerging mayflies, but also underwater there are many larvae for the small roach which are present here in great numbers. These fish are now of no interest to the angler, but thanks to the enormous food supply, the fish here grow quickly, and these small roach will soon reach a catchable size. The larger roach prefer deeper water, and we shall see if Bob Nudd will succeed in catching these bigger specimens. The water is almost completely still. Therefore, here too, the feeder must be pulled along the bottom to release the feed and to ensure that the trace lies evenly in the baited area. Shortly after the cast, there will always be a little slack in the line. This slack is reeled in because only on a tight line can you see the bite. The first roach is hooked, apparently only a small fish, because the rod is only bending at the tip. This is quite different from a fat bream, which always puts a good curve in the feeder rod. The lovers of roach fishing, however, have other reasons. For instance, the nervous type of bites are quite different than those of the bream. And Bob also likes fishing on the drop. You have to be very alert with this kind of fishing. indeed, only a small fish. But this first roach is proof that the feed has been located, and thus other fish will follow. Success in feeder fishing depends for 90% on the precision of the casting. The feed must always land on the same square meter, otherwise the fish will be too spread out and it will take longer for them to find the hook bait. The line clip can be used for the correct distance. As for direction, you need to always cast to a reference point, which demands a good casting technique. At the moment of casting, it's important that the line from the tip is of a consistent length. In a soft flowing motion, the rod is brought back over the head to the 10 o'clock position. Then follows the forward cast, during which the feeder accelerates. At the 1:30 position, the line is released by lifting the finger from the spool. During the flight of the feeder, the rod continues its forward motion till 2:30 to keep line resistance to a minimum. The wind has increased somewhat, but that is not necessarily a problem. Often an increase in wind makes the fish more active, so long as the wind is coming from the right direction. Once again, no monster, but nevertheless significantly larger than the fish number 1. The fish came from long way out, but Bob is trying to get it under the rod tip as soon as possible, and succeeding. The fish is lightly hooked, and a disgorger is not even necessary. For Bob, such a day cannot last long enough. Catching lots of fish is nice enough in itself, but catching lots of fish in such a breathtakingly lovely setting is definitely the absolute high point of an angler's fortune. For fishing in running water, more ground bait must be made up than in still water. Here, therefore, 2 packs of ready-to-use feeder mix are required. Bob always starts by moistening the mix before assembling his rod. He does this because after the mix has been dampened, it must stand for about 10 minutes before any more water may be added. For fishing in a current, the mix must be made somewhat heavier by adding more water than usual. When fishing in running water, the quiver tip is always a little bent from the pressure of the water on the line. This pressure should be minimized as much as possible. That's why the rod is positioned higher here than when fishing in still water. In running water, it's not wise to fish with the rod too low to the water. The pressure of the current on the line would be too great to give an adequate bite indication. And in addition, the current won't allow the feeder to remain in position. It's much better to set the rod higher. By increasing the distance between the rod tip and the water's surface, most of the main line is kept out of the water, and the pressure on the remaining line beneath the surface is greatly reduced. Also, the terminal rig is slightly adapted for running water. The heavy feeder exerts considerable strain on the line. Due to the force of running water, the feeder can damage the knot after a period of time. By lengthening the piece of line upon which the feeder runs, this problem can be simply solved. In contrast to still water, the feeder should not be pulled across the bottom in running water. The trace will always come to face downstream of the feeder, exactly in the patch of feed. Look, a bite already. Here on the Maas, you normally don't have long to wait before you get a bite. The quality of the water in recent years has improved, and there are plenty of fish. Bob casts across the stream, sometimes even a little upstream, if the current is very strong. Here, Bob is using a wide mesh feeder. The mix is heavy and solid, and must come out of the feeder slowly. In spite of the strong current, Bob is fishing here not with the heavy 3-ounce tip, but with the much lighter 2-ounce tip. The fact is that the tip must be bent to register drop-back bites properly. Another bream. Although roach are regularly taken on this stretch of the Maas, the bream here in this current are pleasantly strong. The tip is bent, and underwater there is a good balance between the weight of the lead and the pressure of the current. When the fish bites, it lifts the bait, so that the feeder comes loose from the bottom and begins to drift downstream. The critical balance between current and lead weight is therefore broken, resulting in the dropping back of the quiver tip. This balance is therefore very important. If the lead is too heavy, you will see less bites. And if the lead is too light, then the feeder won't remain in position, but will drift with the current. If the current increases, a heavier lead must be put on. Normal weights for running water are from 40 to 100 grams in extremely strong current. Even 120 grams is sometimes used. Here the 40-gram weight is being changed for a 70-gram. For feeder fishing in a river, Bob is only adding maggots and casters to the mix. The mix must be released constantly and evenly, which would be a problem with the bigger worms. Squeeze the ingredients firmly together, and then this mix will be evenly spread by the current. In this way, the trail of bait will have a long working effect. Bob prefers to keep direct contact with the line. In this way, he can best tell when the feeder has reached the bottom. Because the use of heavy lead is a necessity here, Bob is fishing with a line of 0.22 millimeters. The trace is 0.18 millimeters. In running water, The fish are not so suspicious and can therefore be fished for with heavier line. This has the added advantage that the fish can be played out more quickly. Today, Bob is fishing a lake where the fish are a long way from the bank. But the environment here is so incredibly nice, and the fish population of such high quality, that it's well worthwhile trying to overcome this handicap. On some lakes, you can only reach the fish a long way out from the bank. The nature of the bottom can be such that it's only a long way from the shore that the deeper fish-holding areas are to be found. Here we have to deal with such a situation, where the fish will only venture into the shallow margins under exceptional conditions. The first 40 meters are therefore totally uninteresting. To reach the fish, casts of from 50 to 70 meters are needed. Bob always fishes with his personally designed feeder rod. This rod is a standard 11-footer, but can be extended to 13 feet with the addition of an extra section for extreme distance work. The 2-ounce tip has been chosen because there is a strong wind, and then there is always some flow in the water. The tip is strong enough to keep the line taut at a long distance and still bend easily enough on a bite. For this long-distance work, Bob makes use of a braided line. The modern braided lines are very strong with a reduced diameter, so that the pull of the water upon the line is more acceptable than with a monofilament. Another enormous advantage is that these lines have zero stretch, so that even over longer distances, a bite is clearly transmitted to the tip. To achieve the necessary cushion effect during a hard fight, and also to enable the casting of a heavy feeder, a shock absorber is tied on, consisting of a length of 0.22 monofilament. The only way to join monofill and braided line is by means of a loop. The shock absorber is tied to the loop with a half blood knot. The length of the shock absorber is not of crucial importance. Bob chooses about 5 or 6 turns on the spool, and then he trims the line near the rod butt. For a long distance, we are using a so-called speed feeder, with the weight and tile located at the front. The fine-meshed speed feeder is meant for deeper water. A second fine-meshed feeder has an aerodynamically shaped body, so it can cut through the wind and maintain a good direction. But today, the preference is for a speed feeder which quickly releases the feed, because in this situation, the water, even 60 meters from the bank, is not so deep. The loop method is also by far the best for distance fishing. With the Paternoster Rig, there is much more chance of tangling, especially with a long cast. As soon as he has chosen his reference point, Bob is ready to start. The mix is firmly squeezed so it doesn't fly out during the cast. The heavy feeder and the thin line cut easily through the wind. With a pull of the rod, the feeder is emptied, and the hook length is perfectly placed in the baited area. The slack is taken in, and the fishing can begin. In this rough weather, the fish are very active and the bait is positively taken. A beautiful roach is the first capture. The fish here are strong and healthy. You don't catch roach of this caliber every day, so you can see that it's well worthwhile overcoming the difficulties of long-range fishing by using this specialist tackle. To have success in feeder fishing, you must not be too miserly with the amount of feed. The maggots must be fresh, so that they remain good and lively. It's well known that bream are besotted with casters. Bob always keeps part of the maggots in a separate container with a little water in it. And of course, worms are a must when after big bream. Bob is having success today with the soaked maggot, but that could all change tomorrow. The preference for baits can change during the course of a day's fishing. Therefore, a good feeder fisherman must not rest on his laurels. Experimentation is a prerequisite for success. The waves created by this strong wind are not enough to affect this 2-ounce tip. The bite, however, is perfectly registered. The feed is firmly squeezed with the thumb because it must remain secure in the feeder during the cast and when sinking. The braided line has one important disadvantage. It has a tendency to float. Because of this, to ensure that the line sinks, the rod top is held under water while the line is being tightened. Due to the wind, the tip is never still, but moves in a regular pattern. Each variation in this pattern, however slight, can indicate a bite. Bob never hesitates to strike at any indication. When you are fishing with braided line, you must strike carefully, because there is no stretch in it. The advantage of this line, however, greatly outweighs the disadvantages when fishing at long range. This gives a great boost in positioning the feeder, because contact is so much more direct. With monofilament, you are only taking out the stretch without moving the feeder to the correct place. Also, when playing the fish, you must be more careful not to break the line. When reeling in over this shallow and rocky bottom, there is a danger of snagging. Therefore, you must keep the rod tip high, whilst also retrieving quickly. The bait still looks fine, so let's recast right away. because you can only catch when the bait is in the water. The rod moves through a vertical plane in the direction of the reference point. The line is feathered, so it can't bow in the wind. Now wait till the feeder touches the bottom. Draw the feeder back to empty it, and with the tip under water, tighten the line to allow it to sink. Guidelines that Bob routinely uses, but all of which are needed for success. Once the fish come well onto the feed, one bite follows another. Bob really likes to see his rod bent. He has about 30 years angling experience, and it would be difficult to estimate just how many tons of roach and bream he has caught during this time. And yet, for Bob, each new fish is a new adventure. Feeder fishing is not just for the more advanced angler. It's an outstanding method for all fishermen, even beginners. The bait lies permanently on the bottom, just where bream and roach are seeking their food. The ground bait falls automatically near the hook, and the sensitive tip easily shows the presence of feeding fish. The outlay of a lot of money on tackle is not essential. The casting technique is much more important, so that the feed always comes to land in the same area. You really don't have to be an expert. By using the feeder, any competent angler of normal ability can make good catches. Bob Nudd certainly can anyway. The lake is not yet empty of fish, but as near as damn it. Bob is well satisfied in any case. He has caught enough for today. Fishing must remain a pleasure, not a chore. It has been a hugely successful day. It's not even possible to lift the net, and Bob really doesn't know for sure the weight of his catch. That's not important either, because today was not a match day, just about pure pleasure. We can be sure, however, that there must be over 70 kilos of fish in the net, and that's not too bad for a couple of hours fishing. Among the mass of wriggling maggots, there are always some which are in the stage of changing to casters. Bob proceeds to separate these by sieving. The maggots wriggle through the mesh and drop into the bucket, leaving the casters behind. Good maggots must be lively. This is extra important when they are being used in feeder fishing because they have to crawl out of the feeder itself. Bob picks a big feeder that is heavily weighted because we are fishing here in streamy water. Maggot feeders don't have open bottoms, of course, because if they did, then the maggots would all fall out during the cast. And it's precisely the intention that the maggots constantly crawl out through the holes so that they produce a baited area close to the hook. The maggot feeder maintains its position in the current better than normal open-bottomed feeders. This is because of its closed form, as well as the extra weight, naturally, of the maggots. The fishing technique remains the same, except that with the maggot feeder you can expect more roach, and therefore the slightest movement of the tip must be answered by a strike. On waterways there is, of course, boat traffic which stirs up the bottom. It's often at this moment that a bite results, due to the induced movement of the bait. Large bream are caught less often on the maggot feeder than when they are being fished for using groundbait. But Bob likes this local fish because it's not one he sees every day at home. This fish is much less common in England. The maggot feeder is not exclusively used for roach and bream fishing. In park waters, for instance, especially for small carp, it's an outstanding method. And this, of course, provides excitement of the highest order. The bites are jerky but strong. The fish is seldom missed, and so you keep pleasantly busy. Bob only uses the landing net when it is really needed. This smaller fish he can easily handle without the net. Successful feeder fishing is not only dependent on perfect casting or the choice of hook bait. It's a combination of all these factors. Start with a good rig, mostly the loop method, and only the Paternoster when fishing specifically for roach. Fix the casting distance and choose a reference point. Use the line clip except when fishing deep water. Place the cast with the utmost precision. Pull the feeder to empty it, except when fishing in running water. Choose the right tip for the conditions and make sure the line is tight to the tip. Don't overwet the feed, because only fairly dry feed is effective. Only on running water should you make the mix wetter, and squeeze it harder in the feeder. Choose the weight of the feeder carefully to achieve a good balance. Fish with the tip close to the water when there is no current, but good and high in running water. And last but not least, have confidence. That will result, sooner or later, in a net just as full as this world champion's. Bob Nudd wishes you tight line.